Bill Cosby has been found guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated assault. Cosby was charged in an attack against Canadian Andrea Constand in 2004. And let's bring in Natasha Fata with more. So Natasha, what more do we know?
Andrew, just moments ago, we got the verdict from the jury, guilty on all 3 counts. And so that's fairly significant because he's been charged with 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. Each conviction could put him in prison for up to 10 years on each count. So Bill Cosby, 80 years old, formerly one of the most beloved people in the United States, one of the most successful comedians in the world, could be going to jail for the rest of his life. Now, the sentencing date has not yet been established, and this is just developing as we're speaking to you. So we'll continue to watch for that and when that date will be set. But what a change in what we experienced in the first trial, because I want to remind folks about what this case was about. This case is about a Canadian woman, Andrea Constand, who was at one point in her life treating Bill Cosby as a mentor. She had developed a friendship with him more than a decade ago in Pennsylvania. She was working at a university, at Temple University. He was active in that university, sponsored many programs there, was involved with the student body, and took her on and said, why don't you come to my home? She was invited to his mansion in Pennsylvania, and that's where she presented this story over the course of the trial. And she has done this in the past, also in the first trial, saying that he had drugged her, given her blue pills, and they then made her dizzy, made her pass out. When she came to, she was unable to move her body, and she alleged that time that Bill Cosby was sexually assaulting her, and that she reported this to her friends and family, reported this to her mother. It devastated her, and she never fully recovered from it. Bill Cosby has been accused on many, many occasions of some form of sexual assault, sexual aggression, rape, violence, but none of those came to criminal charges except this one case. And as a result, we now have a conviction on all 3 counts. Many, many people quite stunned, but we have to keep in mind, Andrew, this is after the Me Too movement. This is after Time's Up, and many people were pointing to that in this second trial, saying that this time, if the law hasn't changed, perhaps the perspective of the jurors have. We don't know if that had anything to do with how the jury made their decision, but certainly in global perspective, how we talk about consent and violation and violence, this certainly tainted the way the story moved forward.
Yeah, certainly. But, I mean, you never know what goes on in the minds of juries when they go through these deliberations. But I guess one of the key questions is what would be different from this trial to the last trial that ended up in a hung trial or a mistrial, this trial ending in a conviction?
Well, we don't know because we're not privy to what those conversations are like. We do know that the jury immediately, almost immediately when they started their deliberation process this week, had questions. And their very first question to the judge was, can we get a clear definition of consent? For many people watching, this was central to the storyline of this trial, of this whole, not only the story of Bill Cosby, but the whole issue of sexual violence, saying, well, if...
And they couldn't get that under Pennsylvania law, right?
That's right. The judge said no.
Yeah.
Said, you've gone through the trial. I've given you hours of instructions on how to move forward with your deliberations. I cannot give you, at this stage, a definition of consent. So for some who were watching, they perceived that as perhaps it was going to be a not guilty verdict because they weren't clear on, the jury was not clear on what consent meant, and if they weren't clear on that, then perhaps they couldn't be clear on Andrea Constand's ability to give consent. But as it turns out, often because we're not behind those closed doors, as those jury members are making those discussions and deliberations and considering all the evidence that has been provided to them, we don't know how they ended up working that out. We know the picture that was painted for them by the 2 sides. Bill Cosby's defense certainly said that Andrea Constand was a woman that was manipulating her relationship with Bill Cosby, a famous, likable, wealthy man, and that she was trying to get money from him. We know that he did pay her several $1 million as a result of a civil suit that she brought forward years ago. And so they were using that case of the civil suit to say, this is essentially a money-hungry woman who could not handle her finances, that didn't pay her bills, that owed her roommates money, and that's what she was doing. Of course, Andrea Constand's lawyers were presenting the argument that this is a man who has a history of doing this type of violent acts, and in fact joked about this type of violence and drugging and raping women in his comedy very early on in the 60s and 70s. He was routinely using this as part of his comedic routines. He's ended up dropping that when he became much more wholesome. So those were the very two conflicting narratives that were presented to the jury, and we didn't know how it was going to turn out, but we certainly know now guilty.